We've talked about religious psychosis at length on this channel, specifically as it pertained to the rapture talk that swept TikTok last year. So I'm sure it's no shock that in other types of spiritual and religious beliefs, like more New Age, astrological types of beliefs, that this kind of psychosis can happen in those communities too. But with the situation we're talking about today, it literally went to an extreme. Because during the lunar eclipse in April 2024, a woman would become so caught up in her astrological beliefs that she would end up killing her entire family. So today, we are jumping right on into it and trying to understand what it looks like when the spiritual psychosis isn't just something people make fun of on the internet, it actually ends lives. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. I'm Erin, and I'm fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. So if you like that sort of thing, please subscribe. I would absolutely love to have you here. Now, yesterday was my birthday. Whee! I'm not going to tell y'all how old I am, but you can take a guess in the comments. But I know I missed last week's upload. I was dealing with some health issues, so I really appreciate your patience there. But the video about the Duggars, every Duggar video I have done, it seems, has gotten demonetized because YouTube's algorithm is just changing and their rules about what stays monetized versus what doesn't stay monetized is becoming more and more strict. Now, this isn't necessarily the biggest deal for me because I think a lot of you know this isn't my primary source of income. In fact, it's kind of more in the hobby lane right now. Fingers crossed, But the most heartbreaking thing about this is when a video is demonetized, YouTube itself has no incentive to push the video out. So there are these really, really important topics that are just going to be missed and not talked about. And a lot of creators might just stop creating that type of content completely because YouTube doesn't allow it on the platform, essentially. So I just wanted to let you guys know that starting in June, I'm really going to try to post all of my content that involves issues like what are happening with the Duggars. I'm going to try to move that over to Spotify. I think I'm also going to create a membership, and the first tier will be just like $2, but it's not like about the money or whatever for me. I just want to get the information out there. So you'll be getting bonus videos about more topics like that with more updates and probably more lives if you join the membership. So keep an eye out for that. But with all that being said, we're going to jump on into this heartbreaking story. At 7:35 in the morning on April 8th, 2024, a neighbor in a Woodland Hills apartment building called the Los Angeles Police Department to report an open door. There was blood on the floor inside the unit. There was blood in the hallway. There was a trail of bloody footprints leading from the apartment to the elevator. When officers arrived, they found the body of a 29-year-old Air Force veteran named Jaelen Allen Chaney on the floor. A knife was beside him. Tarot cards, candles, feathers, religious figurines, and altars were scattered across the apartment. And the home itself was in a state of total disarray. Bags of trash, piles of laundry, dishes unwashed. And within hours, 2 other bodies would be linked to that apartment. An 8-month-old infant, dead on the 405 freeway after being expelled from a moving SUV, and the woman who had owned the apartment, the knife, and the altars would also be found dead in Redondo Beach, where she had driven her Porsche into a tree at over 100 miles an hour. The woman's name was Danielle Johnson. To more than 100,000 followers on Twitter, she was known as MysticxLipstick, and to her clients, she was Danielle Ayoka, a divine healer, a Reiki master, and an astrologer with what she called magic in her blood. But to LAPD, she was a triple homicide suspect who had unalived herself before they can question her about why. Now, in the days before her death, she'd pinned a tweet to her profile that began with the words, wake up, the apocalypse is here." This is the story of how a woman who built a six-figure online business healing other people's trauma was unable to access care for her own. It is the story of an X account with 100,000 followers that was radicalizing in plain sight while the platform monetized every post. It's also the story of postpartum psychosis in a community where Black women are statistically less likely to be diagnosed, less likely to be treated, and more likely to die. And it's the story of a movement called conspirituality, the pipeline that has been quietly funneling wellness audiences into QAnon, anti-Semitism, and apocalyptic delusion for the better part of a decade. 3 people dead. A 9-year-old girl is still alive. And the systems that failed every single one of them remain exactly where they are. But who was the woman at the center of it all? And how did we get here? Danielle Johnson was born in 1989 to a 16-year-old mother named Sharonda Cole. Sharonda was struggling with addiction, and Danielle's father had already left, and within a few years, Sharonda made the decision that would shape her daughter's entire life. She gave her up. Not to the state, but to a relative, Sharonda's uncle, a Navy veteran living with his wife in Virginia, a setup Sharonda believed would give Danielle the stability that she could not. Sharonda would later describe this as the ultimate sacrifice. Danielle, however, would describe it as abandonment. She grew up anxious. By her teenage years, she was a full-on hypochondriac, convinced that any headache might be a brain aneurysm and that any cough might be lung cancer. No one in her life seemed to know where this anxiety came from, and no one knew what to do with it. And the gap between what Danielle needed and what the adults around her could provide would never really close. By the time she enrolled at Norfolk State University in 2010, Danielle was a psychology major and a regular at her roommate Maya's Baptist church. She wasn't particularly religious, though. She was, by her own quiet admission, trying to repair her relationship with her absent mother, and she thought maybe God could help her do it, but he could not, and she would drop out of school her junior year. So instead of finishing this degree in clinical psychology, which is the very field that, with 2 more years of work, might have been able to teach her how to recognize the symptoms that would inevitably end her life, Danielle decided to turn to alternative practices: numerology, shamanism, Reiki, astrology. She told her friends since childhood that she had psychic abilities, that she'd been seeing things since she was 3 years old, and that intuition was a kind of inheritance. Now she had a name for it. Now she literally had a discipline. So in 2011, she created the Twitter account MysticxLipstick and started posting. In 2013, she met a man named Cecil Rice on Twitter. He was a Procter & Gamble employee in Springfield, Ohio. Straight-laced, corporate, not really a spiritual person in any meaningful way, but he liked that Danielle was funny. And he liked that despite what he'd later describe as her tough life, that she didn't carry her pain like a wound. It was instead a badge of honor. They married in 2014 and had a daughter together in 2015. And it was in 2015, almost exactly when the baby was born, that Mystic Lipstick would explode. What happened to Danielle wasn't a personal aberration. It was literally this cultural moment that started to build her up. And then it would inevitably be that cultural moment that would break her. I mean, anyone can be a creator. Anyone can have influence on social media, and anyone can be an astrologer. There aren't any real credentials. There wasn't a licensing board. There were no continuing education requirements, no ethics communities, no malpractice insurance. If you could write a punchy meme about Scorpio season and tag it correctly, you could build an audience. And if you could build an audience, then you can basically sell them anything. And Danielle could write the memes. She could build the audience. And by 2016, she was being profiled in the Fader. By 2017, she was contributing guest columns to Refinery29. And then she added a stage name, Ioka, and began releasing alternative R&B records under that identity. Her Twitter account, the Mimi blunt spiritual homegirl voice that had drawn in tens of thousands of zodiac curious millennials, raced past 100,000 followers. And Danielle, who had felt invisible most her life, was suddenly being called to something she'd been hungry for since she was a child. She was being anointed. And here's the thing about being called you're anointed. If you're a person with unresolved trauma, which Danielle was, being told that your suffering was actually divinity is not a neutral piece of information. It is a hit of one of the most powerful drugs in the human pharmacopoeia. It's literally the answer to a question you might have been asking yourself your entire life. Why have I been suffering so much? Why has life been so hard for me? And in Danielle's case, why did my mother choose drugs over me? Why do I feel things differently that other people don't seem to feel? And then the answer becomes, well, it's because you're special, because you are chosen, because the spirit world has marked you for this work. So I think we can all understand the dangerousness of being told this. And for Danielle, it would be a high she would ride until her business became as successful as she wanted it to. She would get a website. She had a menu of astrological reading services. She had guided meditations, spells, cleanses, rituals. And now the cheapest entry point was $2.99, but the premium monthly subscription packages ran $150 a month. So for that fee, clients were promised that Danielle would beam them what she called daily vibes, packets of energy that would activate automatically in their homes through a spiritual link to her aura. So let me be clear about what this actually means in operational terms. It means that Danielle was charging $150 a month for a service that required her to do, in any verifiable sense, nothing. And I'm not being snide about this. There are responsible astrologers. There are responsible spiritual practitioners. I mean, I meditate every single morning. I do believe in some kind of connection to something bigger than myself, but personally, I don't know how to define it. But there are entire religions and indigenous traditions that take this very seriously, but also operate with ethics, with mentorship, and with what amounts to clinical supervision. I mean, this is kind of what defines the difference between somebody who is just offering new tools to you to deal with whatever you might be struggling with versus a cult leader who is trying to exploit your pain and make false promises that they can't actually guarantee. And all Danielle had was a phone. She had a credit card processor and an audience that believed her. And as the audience kept growing and the money kept coming, and after years of struggling financially, Danielle thought, I deserve this. She got a luxury car. She started carrying designer bags. She built the visual vocabulary of a successful Black woman entrepreneur. And to her followers, that visible success was further proof of the anointing. Look what she manifested. Look at what we could manifest too if we just bought the right package. Now, in 2018, things start getting a little more suspicious and dangerous because Danielle would announce a new service line. She would now be offering programs specifically designed for survivors of SA. Her language was urgent and in all caps, and she wrote that this work would help with S addictions and would be paramount for those in any form of S work and SA victims. Her followers, many of them who were survivors themselves, were kind of uneasy. And astrology, however charismatically delivered, is not trauma therapy. Reiki is not EMDR. A person who dropped out of a psychology program in her junior year is not a licensed mental health provider. And when, during one of these so-called tantric healing sessions, Danielle reportedly implied that it was possible to attract SA into someone's life because of their energy or karma or insufficient spiritual hygiene, thank goodness the community pushed back. But Danielle did not respond well. Her replies turned defensive and mean, and the followers who loved her bluntness now saw it weaponized against the very people that she was supposed to help. They were only raising legitimate ethical concerns. But the funny, grounded spiritual homegirl started disappearing under threads of grievance, conspiracy, and grudge keeping. And by 2019, former friends in Danielle's astrology community were reporting that she was tapping into something darker. Rumors began circulating that Danielle was practicing what people in her community called dark magic. Specifically, that she was placing hexes on people she perceived as enemies, including former clients and former friends, by attaching their photographs to cow tongues with 9 nails. Now, this isn't a recognized practice anywhere, not in modern witchcraft, not in Wicca, not in any pagan tradition that I personally am aware of. And people in those communities would come out and specifically disavow what she was doing. And what's even more fascinating is her husband, Cecil, didn't really see any of this directly. What he saw was a wife who was disappearing into her work, into her phone, into spaces he couldn't seem to reach. They had a difficult pregnancy together in 2015, and Danielle had been diagnosed with preeclampsia, a serious pregnancy complication that affects blood pressure and can cause severe headaches and even worse. She'd been, in Cecil's words, in a dark space mentally during and after that pregnancy. He encouraged her to talk to him. He encouraged her to talk to a professional, but she wouldn't. The only treatment she trusted was the very treatment she sold, and the treatment she sold could not touch what was actually happening to her. So Cecil and Danielle separated, but were never formally divorced. She moved with their daughter to New York and got engaged to a tarot card reader in Tribeca, but that fell apart too. She then moved to Los Angeles and made an R&B album titled Venus. Her tweets continued to attract followers and continued, by degrees, to darken. In late 2020, a new customer reached out to MysticxLipstick. He was 25 years old. He was stationed in the U.S. Air Force in Italy, and he worked as a munitions squadron armament technician. His name was Jaelen Allen Chaney. To really understand what happened to Jaelen, you have to understand what the term twin flames means in the contemporary spiritual marketplace. We've talked about twin flames so much on this channel. I have playlists. I've talked about Twin Flames Universe. I have talked about it ad nauseum at this point. But in case you're new here, a twin flame in this particular vocabulary isn't a soulmate. It's more of like an intense designation. Two halves of the same original soul that were somehow separated at the beginning of time and would find each other across multiple incarnations. So where soulmates are partners, twin flames are considered to be inevitabilities. You don't choose your twin flame, the universe chooses for you. And your twin flame is yours regardless of whether they want to be, regardless of who else is in their life, and regardless of who they thought they were before they met you. So in the hands of a responsible practitioner, the twin flame concept can be a metaphor for self-discovery. But in the hands of someone with poor boundaries and an audience, it's a tool of coercion. Now, Jaelen and Danielle began their relationship over distance, over services Danielle was selling him while he was overseas. And by the fall of 2021, he was, in Danielle's public framing, her twin flame. She also told her mother that she had promoted Jaelen to what she called Coven Master, a leadership role within the virtual coven that Danielle ran with her paying subscribers. But what Jaelen's family and friends did not understand, and what surfaced in reporting only after his death, was this. Jaelen had openly been gay before he met Danielle. He had dated men exclusively and had even come out to his family. But Danielle's interpretation of this was not that Jaelen was a gay man who was now exploring a relationship with a woman. Her interpretation was that Jaelen's gayness was a trauma response, that his sexuality was a deviation from his true higher self, that through her healing, through her tantric work, through her S-magic, through what she described as spells designed to strengthen their soulmate connection, she could restore him to his cosmic alignment. So if you're recognizing the structure of this argument, it's because you've heard it before. You've heard it from conversion therapists. You've heard it from controlling parents. You've heard it from religious institutions that have been doing harm to queer people for as long as queer people have existed. The mystical language is new, but the mechanism of it is ancient. And friends watched it happen. One friend told reporters that he didn't see anything strange when he met Danielle in person, but others worried that they were watching someone they loved be totally consumed and changed. When Jaelen moved into the Woodland Hills apartment with Danielle, her older daughter, and eventually Danielle's mother, Sharonda, who had reconciled with Danielle and was now living with her, Sharonda started to see things that she didn't really know what to do with. She said that Danielle had named herself queen of the underworld. She was inviting what she described as demons and dark spirits into the apartment to ward off the people she believed were trying to harm her relationship. And one of those people, Danielle had decided, was Jaelen's own mother. Danielle believed Juanita was performing black magic to break them apart, and she pressured Jaelen to cut off contact. And he, by all accounts, complied, not because he agreed, but because the woman he lived with had become someone you don't say no to. And so Sharonda, watching this from inside the home, did the thing that a mother does. She tried to suggest Danielle see a doctor, not a spiritual healer, an actual doctor. But as you probably guessed, Danielle was not interested. But Shonda also separately told Jaelen on social media that he should run from Danielle as fast as he could. And when Danielle found out, she threw her own mother out of the apartment. Sharonda, the woman who had once given Danielle up to her uncle, who had spent years working to reconcile with the daughter she'd left, would end up in a homeless shelter. And by 2023, they were no longer in contact. The last time Sharonda saw her daughter alive, they happened to pull up next to each other in Los Angeles traffic. And Sharonda didn't even know that Danielle was pregnant. Now, around October 2023, Danielle and Jaelen's daughter, Soleil, was born. Now, I want to pause here because there is a brief trigger warning about child loss. We are going to be speaking about the death of Soleil. And unfortunately, this tragic story we're about to tell happened while a lot of people were watching as they scrolled past on their feeds, not really knowing what exactly was going on. Now, Cecil Rice, Daniel's still legal husband, reached out to her when he heard she'd had a second baby because he'd been worried about her for years. I mean, they didn't even separate legally. They'd been separated, but they weren't actually divorced. So he'd probably been keeping tabs on her for years. And he'd known her first pregnancy had been a mental health crisis, so he wanted to check in. And when he did, he said that Danielle was standoffish. The thing she wanted to talk about was losing baby weight. The other thing she wanted to talk about was getting their long overdue divorce processed so she could marry Jaelen. And that wasn't the only thing that had changed. Her social media presence had completely transformed, and not in a good way. By late 2023 and early 2024, she was sharing posts claiming that CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, was preparing to open a portal to another spiritual realm on April 8th. She was sharing claims that Tesla time machines were under Cheyenne Mountain and were preparing to activate. She was retweeting QAnon adjacent accounts. She was sharing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, anti-vaccine misinformation, claims about CIA mind control, claims about Madonna, about Kurt Cobain leaving deep state clues, claims about baby T-word, claims about secret media messaging. This is where we fall into the idea of the movement called conspirituality. Now, this term was coined by the academics Charlotte Ward and David Was in 2011 to describe this hybrid worldview that emerges when New Age spiritual practices fuse with political conspiracy theory. It'd been documented, studied, and named by the journalists Derek Perez, Matthew Remski, and Jillian Walker, who host a podcast and even wrote a book by that name for years. It's a great podcast. This, though, is not a fringe new phenomenon. It is the dominant ideological drift in the wellness industry, and it's just been accelerating since 2020, even though the term was coined in 2011. And this reason is structural. The wellness world and the conspiracy world share three foundational premises. The first is that mainstream institutions like medicine, government, journalism, science, they're all corrupt, they're all captured, or they're actively malicious. The second is that intuition and personal experience are more reliable forms of knowing than expert consensus. It's basically trusting anecdotes rather than a tested, double-blind, multi-sourced clinical trial that's not paid for by someone who's going to benefit from the results of that study. And the third thing is that there is a hidden truth, accessible only to those willing to wake up, and it will explain why the world feels the way it does. I mean, yoga teachers, Reiki masters, energy healers, sound bath practitioners, herbalists, they're all populations primed by training to distrust the medical establishment and actually trust the body's wisdom, which can obviously be very beneficial, especially in a world where a lot of women, specifically in this case, Black women, are not given the proper study and care to assess certain symptoms. So, obviously, people who fall into this category are going to mistrust doctors if doctors have kind of turned a blind eye to them and their symptoms for years, if not decades. But it is this mistrust of these institutions, although they've let people down, that cause someone to turn towards QAnon central pitches, which is at its core that you and the people that you love are being lied to constantly and can only be awakened if you can see their truth. So I think we've all noticed since 2020 the Wellness-to-QAnon Pipeline that seems to be a phenomenon. And by 2024, when Danielle Johnson was sharing those posts about portals and Cheyenne Mountain time machines, she was not like this aberration. She's basically the median outcome. And there is a separate question, and it is literally the central question of this episode, about whether the content drove the breakdown or whether the breakdown drove the content. But the answer is both. They're kind of symbiotic. People who are experiencing emerging psychosis often gravitate toward conspiratorial material because it provides a framework, a way of organizing the feelings that something is deeply wrong. And conspiratorial material, in turn, feeds and shapes that delusion. So the pattern is very well documented in psychiatric literature. What is not in dispute, though, is this. Danielle Johnson's feed was visibly destabilizing in the weeks before her death. Her posts were getting 11 million views, and no one on the platform intervened. There was no warning, there was no flag, no nothing. The platform wasn't going to do this, though. They weren't going to lose money on her engagement, so the platform decided to do nothing. We have to start recognizing that our attention means money. If you are giving your energy, your time, your views to anything, even if you dislike it, even if you hate it, even if you're just talking about it on social media, the algorithm is not paying attention to your feeling. The algorithm is paying attention to the data. What are people talking about? It doesn't care if it's positive or negative. It doesn't care if you're saying, take this down. Your attention is effectively money. So the platform is going to consistently put things out that talk about these dangerous practices, even maybe lift them up, because the algorithm, the platform wants to keep making money, and attention makes money. The only reason every single social media at this point is all ads is because of the attention. There is more value in paying an influencer to talk about a product than there is to put a commercial on your television at this point. That's how valuable our attention is. And that is why these algorithms are streamlined to get you addicted to these platforms so that you will get their attention. And it doesn't, again, matter how you feel about the content you're watching, you're consuming. If you comment, if you talk about it, it is only going to feed you more and more and more and more of that thing because the platform wants your attention, because it wants you to see the ads, and that is how it's making its money. The platform is never going to take something down because people are talking about it, even if it means it's disgusting and abhorrent. Now, last year's total solar eclipse over North America on April 8th was, by any astrological reading, a significant event. Eclipses in astrological frameworking marks thresholds, endings, beginnings, and transformations. People in the astrology community often post about it. People outside the astrology community were also posting about it. I mean, NASA was posting about it. It was a big sky event in a country with cable news. So most people posted about it the way most people would post about a celestial event. But Danielle did not do this. On April 4th, she wrote, quote, "This eclipse is the epitome of spiritual warfare. Get your protection on and your heart in the right place." She was offering, for free with a like, what she called a stay in control eclipse flash spell, designed in her language to combat the fact that the eclipse was lining up with what astrology calls the nodes of fate. The spell would be effective for 6 months, and it would burn all misfortune and unfair outcomes out of the lives of those who participated. On April 5th, she pinned the tweet that would later become the centerpiece of every news story about her death. In all caps, she wrote, wake up, the apocalypse is here. Everyone who has ears, listen. Your time to choose what you believe is now. If you believe a new world is possible for the people, right now. There is a power in choice. There is a power in choice. Repost to make the choice for the collective. And then she pulled her 9-year-old daughter out of school that week. The final post on her account dated April 7th, and it was a retweet from an account called Q the Storm, a QAnon-aligned handle. And it read, "Alert, this is the final warning. Turn notifications on. Do not look at the eclipse. Something big is coming." And she posted the word love dozens of times that very same day. Now around 3:40 in the morning on April 8th, 2024, hours before the eclipse, neighbors in the Woodland Hills apartment building heard fighting, yelling. According to the LAPD timeline, this is when Danielle stabbed Jaelen Chaney. Investigators would later find evidence that she had attempted to remove his body from the apartment, leaving the trail of blood that the neighbor would see later in the hallway. But she did not succeed. She would return him to the apartment and leave the door open behind her. She put her 2 daughters in the Porsche, and she drove south. And the rest gets very, very tragic. You might want to skip ahead if you don't want to hear any details of what happened to her children. On the 405 freeway in Westchester, around the time most people in LA were sleeping, Danielle pushed her 9-year-old daughter out of the moving car. The 9-year-old was holding 8-month-old Soleil. And LAPD Lieutenant Guy Golan's words, and these are some of the hardest words to read aloud that I've ever encountered in this work. But they said, quote, "As the 9-year-old fell into the middle of the highway, she injured herself and dropped the infant. In a race to get out of the freeway and not get hit by traffic, the 9-year-old managed to get to the shoulder successfully. But the infant was struck by traffic. And so the infant succumbed to her injuries in the middle of the freeway." It's absolutely heartbreaking, like the visual of that. There were some good Samaritans that found the 9-year-old and they called 911. But Soleil was pronounced dead at the scene. And then the 9-year-old was brought to the hospital. But Danielle just kept on driving. Now, can you imagine the confusion of being that little girl? Like, I've covered a lot of traumatic events on this channel. I think this might be one of the most traumatizing events I've ever heard a little girl go through. Because also she's old enough to remember that her very own mother pushed her out of a moving vehicle and then she couldn't save her baby sister. I just really hope this little girl is taken care of. Because as for her mother kept driving. She drove south to Redondo Beach and accelerated to over 100 miles an hour and drove into a tree. And by mid-morning, before the eclipse had even peaked over Southern California, 3 people were dead. So what was going on? Why did she do this? What was going on inside her head? And I want to talk about this carefully because it's easy to draw conclusions, and I feel like whatever type of easy framework you try to put on this, it's going to end up wrong. So the first easy thing to say is just the tabloid one. You know, she was crazy. The astrology made her do it. The eclipse drove her over the edge. But luckily, LAPD pushed back on this in their public statements. The Lieutenant Guy Golan asked the rhetorical question that closed most of the news coverage at the time. How many people wrote about the eclipse and didn't go out and murder somebody? And most of the people in Danielle's online community essentially believed what she believed, and they didn't try to kill anyone. We can't just treat her ideology as the only cause of this because it kind of flattens out a severe psychiatric crisis. And although I do believe that people can succumb to spiritual or religious psychosis, I also believe that humans do have the wherewithal to recognize when certain behavior is really crossing a line. There's a secondary frame that people who are trying to be extra careful kind of talk about on this, and they might be missing some nuance. What they say is that Danielle had a clinical psychotic break, the spiritual content was incidental, and the astrology was just what her brain happened to reach for. And the thing that we're really talking about is mental illness that wore a costume. Now, this framing, although it's more compassionate, in my opinion, it's still a little bit wrong. Religious psychosis is not a standalone diagnosis. There's not a DSM entry for it. It's a recognized phenomenon in which psychotic symptoms like delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking all take religious or spiritual context. Postpartum psychosis is a distinct clinical emergency, which affects between 1 and 2 of every 1,000 births. It typically onsets in the first week after delivery, but can also emerge later, and it does involve hallucinations, paranoid delusions, dramatic mood swings, profound confusion, and a sharp loss of insight into one's own condition. And it's associated with an elevated risk of both unaliving and child harm. Now, I believe that postpartum psychosis was most certainly a factor in this. And I want to return to that, but I want to ask the harder question, the one that I think I owe you here. Isn't really what diagnostic category Danielle fit into. It is, what was she actually thinking and believing the morning of April 8th? If we read her final week posts, they're not the posts of a person who thinks she's about to commit a crime. They're the posts of a person who thinks she's about to perform a rescue. The apocalypse is here, pick a side. There's power in choice. Repost to make the choice for the collective. A new world is possible for the people. Get your protection on. Burn all misfortune out of your life. Stay calm, healthy, grounded. This is the final warning. Something big is coming. It's all salvation language. We've seen it countless times on this channel. It's the exact same thing that post-apocalyptic cult leaders do and say. It's the same thing that Jim Jones said that drove almost 1,000 people to take their own lives. It's a vocabulary of someone who is believing that a transformation is imminent, that 2 timelines are diverging, and the question is whether you're aligned with the right one and whether the people you love are coming with you. And there's this panic about an event that she really believed was about to take everyone she loved from her if she did not act. So from within this framework, her family was not safe in the world that existed on April 7th. The eclipse in her cosmology was going to do something irreversible. She'd spent years telling her audience and herself that she was the person specifically positioned to act when this kind of moment arrived. She'd named herself the queen of the underworld. She'd told her mother she was promoting her partner to coven master. She'd built a public identity around the premise that she had cosmic authority and responsibility. And there is a clinical term for what investigators studying maternal violence in psychotic states have spent half a century documenting. The term is altruistic filicide. It is a documented psychiatric pattern in which a parent, almost always a parent in the grip of severe psychotic depression, postpartum psychosis, or another acute psychiatric crisis, actually kills their beloved because they're believing they're saving them from suffering, from damnation, or from a worse death. They're saving them from something the parent has come to believe is coming for the child that the parent can't prevent any other way. This is literally the spiritual version of Lori Vallow, thinking that she is saving her children and allowing them to be the 144,000 by harming them. It's the same thing flipped on its head. So from inside that delusion, it doesn't feel like murder. It feels like the only choice that loves them. Now, I can't say that this is definitively what happened. I am not someone who can diagnose anyone. I'm someone who believes in understanding the nuance of situations like this. Sharing this information is absolutely not to justify anything she did. I think that It's really easy as humans to want to find the exact reason why somebody does something so horrific to people they're supposed to love. So I think it's really easy to have a singular line of thought. She was evil, she was a murderer, she was a killer. But I think when we combine everything together, we have this postpartum psychosis mixed with some religious/spiritual psychosis, mixed with a lot of unhealed mental illness, mental health catastrophe, really. And someone who is constantly feeding their own delusions every single day thanks to the algorithm. And not only that, she's put herself up on such a high pedestal that she has to be right. Otherwise, everything she's built for herself, the levels of success she's built for herself, will be completely diminished and false if she doesn't continue to play into the delusion. All of that factors into what happened this tragic, tragic day. Now, this is something I've briefly touched on before, but I do think it's really important to discuss in this context. Now, statistically, Black women in the United States are less likely than white women to be diagnosed with postpartum mood disorders, and they're statistically less likely to be referred for psychiatric care. They're statistically less likely to be believed when they describe their symptoms, and they are statistically less likely to receive culturally competent treatment when they do reach a provider. The maternal mental health gap is one of the most documented racial disparities in American medicine, and it does not improve when the patient is a public figure. If anything, it gets worse because the assumption is that the public figure has resources, has access, has agency. And so the people around her just assume, well, someone else is going to catch what's happening. But in this case, no one caught it. The spiritual community Danielle had built around herself was constitutionally incapable of catching it. The framework she spent 15 years constructing treated psychiatric symptoms just as spiritual phenomena. Hearing voices is a gift. Paranoid ideation is psychic awareness. Mood instability is the energy of the ancestors. Refusing medication is honoring the body's wisdom. So by the time Danielle was naming herself the queen of the underworld, her framework had no way to register that something was wrong because everything she was experiencing had this positive valence within the worldview she was sold. And this isn't unique to astrology or Reiki. It's a structural risk that any spiritual framework that does not have a robust theology of mental illness, which is to say almost all of the spiritual frameworks currently being marketed to American consumers in the wellness economy, literally hurts the people that most likely need actual psychiatric care, who are instead being told that their very serious mental health symptoms are gifts, that medicine is poison, and doctors are part of some secret cabal. To keep this from happening again, we have to collectively demand more understanding of not just the woman's body, but the Black woman's body. We need to listen to these experiences, and we need to be able to discern when someone is just trying to sell us something online or a behavior even online, and whether it's something we need to take seriously or not. I think that any spiritual practice needs to have some kind of root in reality, something tangible, something real that you can grasp onto, seeing the evidence for yourself. And I would highly encourage anyone who feels more spiritually minded or gifted that, yes, it feeds our ego to think that we have some special ability, but we need to also recognize, but maybe I need a little bit of help. Maybe I need to speak to someone who has dealt with some of these symptoms before. It doesn't mean you're not gifted. It doesn't mean you're not special. I believe there's a difference between trusting our intuition versus recognizing when our minds are playing a trick on ourselves. So my heart breaks for this family, for her daughter, who is still probably dealing and will deal with the effects of this. And I pray and hope that she's getting the mental health support that she needs. And I'll try to leave some resources down in the pinned comment below for you. And I just want to take a minute to really think about what happened here. Let it sink in. This is something that could have completely been avoided with intervention. And we just really need to be careful about who and what we're watching on social media. So thank you all for watching this piece of social media. I hope you learned something. If there's anything you want to discuss, please do so in the comments below respectfully. And I just want to say once again, thank you so much for your time and attention. I really, really appreciate it. So with all that being said, please stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. I will see you in my next video very soon. Bye.